Mark's in the office.
I saw him earlier, yeah.
Okay. Because the only reason why I say that is because, well, I have to do knowledge sharing with him anyway, and this is going to cover some of it. So I'd like him to be here.
Yeah, just get started whenever you're ready.
All right. Hurry up. I'm way more important. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, we'll just start with that. Okay, let's get started. Thank you everyone for coming. Today's topic is token-based authentication. None shall pass. Right? Okay. Well, I'm a big dork, so I love that movie. I think
I've heard of Monty Python.
So I got my kids saying "none shall pass" a lot, which is funny. So basically, this is what I think about when I think about authentication. Gandalf the Grey standing, over some cliff, screaming "none shall pass." So who uses token-based authentication? Pretty much, this is the new way of doing stuff. Token-based authentication is pretty much prominent everywhere. There is a public-facing API or a very prominent web application. I just listed a few you guys are familiar with, obviously Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and GitHub. And token-based authentication is very important for these APIs so that they scale appropriately. And we'll get into scalability and what it means and why token-based is better, but just as an overview. Why do we use tokens? Well, before we can answer that, we have to look at what did we use before we used tokens. How did we do this in the past? And the way we used to do this in the past was with server-based authentication, basically sessions. If any of you have toyed around in PHP or even Java or, I don't even Node using sessions. That's how we used to do it. But what's the problem with using sessions? The problem in general is that HTTP protocol is stateless. Now I mean, that's a good thing that it's stateless, but that's a problem when it comes to servers. Like, so why is that? The problem is, what's up, Doug? The problem is that, let's say I want some data from a server. Well, the server's just not going to give me that data. It has to know who I am. So I'm going to have to pass in some credentials. Okay, great. Well, the very next time I ask for more data, the server's like, I don't know who you are. I have to authenticate again. So, HTTP in and of itself is stateless, and our servers have no memory. And so how did we traditionally handle this? Which was we would have the applications remember who we were by storing these things in sessions, typically in memory, although you could write to disk as well. But basically sessions information. So in general, how does this typically work? So basically, a user would go to their computer, and they would type in, www.something.com, and the server would deliver the website. And then the user would appropriately log in. The server would say, okay, I understand who you are. I'm now going to save your session. I'm going to save your user information in memory in session. And then every single time a user would request data, the server would check that session object for that user to make sure that they were authenticated, and this would happen essentially on every request. So why is this not so good anymore? Well, the fact that we have sessions means the server must create a new record or maintain a record. Whether they're writing this to disk or they are doing this in memory, it's still overhead that the server has to maintain. Which leads to our next problem, scalability. Basically, this wasn't that big of a deal before mobile devices came about and tablets and, who knows, smart T-shirts are next, where you can access the internet on your socks. Okay, who knows? But basically everything is able to access the internet these days. The internet of everything is the popular term, right? So many devices hitting the server. Server has to maintain all of these records. It's just a ton of server load. Okay, it's a pretty simple problem to generally understand. Can't scale that well. Tokens to the rescue! Superman is awesome, by the way.
I like that.
This is Batman, whatever. I don't want to get into it. Yeah, other side of the table. We're not talking about Batman. All right, tokens to the rescue. So how does the token-based authentication approach work? Generally, token-based authentication is stateless. Right? So really, the high level of this is that we're not storing any information about our user at all. We're simply passing around tokens. Okay, that's the high-level concept. And since we don't have we don't have a reliance on sessions anymore, well, that means that our applications can now scale to handle, a plethora of devices hitting our server. So just like before, a user would sit down on the computer, they type in a website or a laptop, or I should actually have had a tablet on here, a mobile device. They take their device and they hit a website and the server delivers it. User logs in, but this time the server is going to say, okay, I get that you are a valid user. I'm going to create this nifty token and I'm going to send it back to you. And then every single time now that the user asks for data, the client is going to then send that token to the server. The server is going to validate that token and say, oh, I know who you are, and then return data. Okay? Well, that's great. We see something real. Thanks, Don. Does everyone understand so far? The basic, it's pretty, I think a lot of people have encountered this before. So let's see something real. So what we'll be doing today. This past, beginning of April, I rolled off one project and rolled on to another one. It's okay if I say names, right? Okay, so I rolled off of Scholastic, doing some Scholastic work, and I rolled on to a quick project for Pearson, called the Pearson Visualization and Reporting Project, and it's a research project, right? And so they want to spin up this. It's like an analytics project or product, and they want to spin something up quick, and we have full range of technology that we can use, whatever we can do fastest, right? So we built it using Node. We built it using Mongo as the back end, and so it was really just serve up some fake data at one point. But they came back to us and they said, oh, we've got some real data, and by the way, we need an authentication story to go with this. So I have been spending the last 3 weeks digging into tokened authentication, and so I want to share with you the actual implementation, since we are all now on the same page about what tokens do. How do we do it in Node, right? How do we lock down routes? How do we authenticate? How do we generate tokens? How do we do all that stuff? So tools and libraries, sort of what I described already. We'll be using Node and NPM. Express4 is obviously the web framework for Node. MongoDB and RoboMongo. MongoDB is obviously NoSQL database, and RoboMongo is just a GUI for using it. Mongoose, which I found to be very invaluable when using MongoDB. Mongoose is an object modeling tool to essentially, the way I see it is it's just a way to make sense of objects that are stored in Mongo, pull them out, or I should say model objects, pull them out and interact with them, validate them, things of that nature. We're also going to be using JSON Web Token. This is a Node library that is used for generating and verifying tokens. Makes it really easy, actually. And finally, Postman, which is obviously the Chrome tool. So MongoDB and RoboMongo. So let's get started with that. So at a high level, what we're going to be doing is just, I'm just going to precede the database a little bit, and the way that you do this is Mongo has its own sort of API. and you just kind of say, hey, I'm going to create a new connection to MongoDB. I'm going to grab the correct database, which in this case is called GLR. I'm going to drop the database and just add new stuff to it, right? And so here I just have an example of we're just going to create a brand new user into the database. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I apologize if my terminal is really tiny. It's not really important that you see the commands in the terminal. Everything else I bumped up. So in this first shell, I'm going to type in mongod, if that's or MongoD. I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
Oh, I won't.
What, MongoD? Okay. So we start our Mongo database, and then at the root of our application, which is where I am here, in this little window, I'm just going to type in mongo.init.js. Now that mongo.init.js file is this file here, okay? And it's sort of, this is a longer version of what I just showed you in the slide deck, right? So we have the new connection to Mongo, we have the MongoDB, and then we're adding users. We're also adding a bunch of other things that are project specific, but for this talk, we're talking mostly about the users. Okay. So I am going to run this command, and you can see that Mongo did some stuff. And when I open up RoboMongo, you'll see that this user here has been injected into my database. So I'm going to hit refresh. This is my record where I've got my admin user. My password has been hashed or encrypted. First name is admin, last name user, email, and then my role is an administrator. Okay, so we're set to go. Fantastic. So the next thing we want to do is take a look at the server. Okay. One thing that I hate about Node in general and Express and how Wild West it is that nobody yells at you for putting things in weird places. Right? So I can't stand 15,000 line files. I almost can't stand 400 line files, right? Like I like them small. And I really hate the all-in-one implementation. So I want to just share with you, I guess, my approach to Node, my configuration to Node, to starting up a server. Feel free to take this if you want, or not. It's fine. Either one. It's good. In general, what we do is we have a config file. And that config file drives everything. Everything for the application is in the config. And then what we do is we start up our database right away. And I don't do anything else with Node. I don't actually start with Node. I don't build any routes. I don't make the application aware of any middleware until our database connects. If it connects, then we move forward and do that. So let's take a look at that. So here's the config file, and you can see it's pretty big. And let me explain what this is. At the top level, we define application as an object, and then we just have some high-level properties about what it is, the title, description, who wrote it, and then the default environment that Node is just going to spin up automatically. And then we get into more of the important parts, which is the environments, where we have. You can see this is the development environment, and this is the production environment here. And inside of here are different things. So like we're defining where is the server directory, what directory are we serving up, where's our less, what port are we going to run on, are we using a proxy. This secret here is used in building out the tokens. Okay, so I just put in some really long string there, and that's the secret that we'll pull from. As well as database configurations and namespaces. And you might be saying, well, why do you do this, right? So the reason I do this is whenever I deliver this app to, let's say, a production environment, like some of the system admin people, I can tell them to say, look, if you're going to set up a development environment, what you need to write is node client server -- mode is equal to development. Okay? And now that's going to spin up my development code. Everything is going to be unminified. and it's basically it's development, right? So let's say they have a different process where they're going to spin up a production server. Well, you can do the same thing. Whoops. As long as you type in mode is equal to production. And that's going to run, as you can see, on port 4000. And the cool thing about the production port is that, and whether or not system admin people use this, that's fine. They don't have to, right? This is important for me as a developer because a lot of times, whenever you minify code, weird things can happen. And so I like having an environment locally that I can check both development and production. Now I know you can do this with source maps, and probably a cooler way of doing it, but this works as well. Okay. Are there any questions on the configuration itself? I'm going to talk more about how it spins up next, but just basically it's just a JSON file with a bunch of configs in it. All right. So the next thing is you notice that in the command line here, we typed in node client server, right? So client server refers to this file here, client server. And this is essentially what that diagram was. This is exactly what this is here, okay? Where what we're doing is we have this application variable, and I'm saying nconf, get me the application. Nconf is just a library to pull in the JSON. This is pointing directly at that application node that we talked about in the config directory up here. Okay, that's what that's grabbing. And then we basically are iterating over the environments. And basically, based upon the config mode that you entered when you entered that in on the command line, -- mode equal production equals to development, we are going to spin up node. We're going to create some simple environment variables, and then here's where we have sort of that where it maps to the diagram, where we basically say connect to the database. If the database fails, we get an error message. So I'll demonstrate that right now. I'll turn that off. Hold on. Clear. So I'll turn off my database and I'll run npm start. So it says database connection error, Mongo error. We basically did not connect. Okay? And if I turn this back on, it will then reconnect to the database, and now that we're listening on port 3000. All right. So the way that the node is structured, and this is sort of like what I like about doing it this way, is that if you take a look at this client server file and you look at these names, database, engine, middleware, routes, server, all of these map to specific folders under the client server directory. So the client server directory, this is a little hard to see, and I don't know how to make this larger, but under client server, if you want to look up the database implementation, you just go to the database folder and look it up, and it's 31 lines of code. It's very short. If you wanted to look up the HTML configuration, you just go to the engine folder and you say, oh, okay, we're configuring it to use HTML. It's using Hogan, and it's configuring the views directory where it's going to serve up the HTML file. This is only 16 lines of code. It's pretty small. So everything is bite-sized. And to be honest with you, I'm really looking forward to, and maybe others have had more experience with other frameworks. I would love a framework to tell me where to put stuff. I think it would make Node nicer to work with, but that's just my 2 cents. Are there any questions on sort of like just the general setup of how Node is running?
What's the advantage of using that? I think it was nconf or something.
It's just a key. It's just a store, right? So if you actually look at the config file, I have this index file, which is a helper, right? So under configuration, we have this configuration JSON, and then we have this index.js file. And this is where nconf is defined. And nconf is just a key value store, right? That's all it is. And so what we're doing is I'm saying, with this line of code here, nconf, go find me my config file and store it, right? And so then what I can do is I can run all sorts of helper methods off of my nconf environment, off my nconf data store to get API base, to get auth base, to get namespaces, things of that nature, right? So it's a way of storing and dealing with config files.
It looks. Can you go back up a bit? You have a like .rb
Oh, I'm sorry.
.end as well.
At the very
I'm wondering if it grabs, if it lets you like.
So here?
Multiple, yeah. You can. So file is like, is that the last source it'll use?
Yeah.
You can override it with arguments or.
Yeah. So if I wanted to, I could create a file myself, pass that in, and it's going to override everything I've done, right? Yeah. So that's pretty much the advantage. It's just flexibility with configs.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Robust configs.
Robust configurations. Yes.
So you can do the helper methods. You can do files. You can do command lines. That gives you like all the options instead of just loading up a big chunk of JSON.
Mm-hmm.
And you can set the priority yourself too. What takes precedence? So
That's cool.
Okay, so moving on with our token discussion, now that we have our server set up, let's talk about Mongoose. And like I said again before, Mongoose is an object modeling tool. And so basically what we're building here is an API for users, right, /users. So Mongoose is going to help us define that data model and then also help us protect it with validation rules. So at a very, very simple level, I'm going to go through the things you can do with Mongoose, and then I'm going to show you the real-world implementation of how I used it. Oh, and before I get even deeper into this, I am certainly not an expert in this stuff, and some of you guys may have gone deeper than what I'm doing. So feel free to say, oh, by the way, you can do that, or you did this weird. It's totally fine. I would welcome it. Okay, so at a very high level, we just want to define a user model. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, with Node, okay, you just require the Mongoose package or the library, and then you create a schema. So that's at the very, very top. And then you define a simple Mongoose model where you basically say module.exports, and the module.exports, if you're not aware, that makes it publicly available. We're basically defining a new user, and we're saying I'd like a username, a password, and an admin. You know, I want the username to be a string, password to be a string, and admin to be true or false. Pretty simple. But then it allows you to use some built-in validation pieces. So let's say for my password, I wanted to say it absolutely has to be required, cannot be empty, you got to enter something. Well, then you would do something like this, where you would basically say type is a string and required is true. But then you can also add third-party plugins because Mongoose is pretty awesome, but it doesn't have a lot of built-in stuff, and a lot of people have built a lot of things for you. So one of the things I found that I needed was a unique validation tool. I want to be able to say, this username is the only username used in my entire database, that kind of stuff. And so there is a whole host of NPM packages or Node packages out in the web. This one was called Mongoose Unique Validator. You simply add it to your package JSON file. You include it into your file. You use the unique syntax here under username, and then you associate it with your user schema with userschema.plugin. And you go about your business. So it's actually really easy to use plugins. I was shocked at how easy this was. It also has hooks. So, you know, this model, when we talk about the user model, okay, and if you haven't done back-end work before, I mean, what you have to understand is that any time that we write an endpoint and we say, I want to update the user, I might want to post to the user, I might want to put to the user, I might want, well, not post, but you get my point. I want to use my HTTP verbs against the user model. This Mongoose is going to help you make sure the data that goes into the database is going to be what it should be. Okay, so for instance, let's say when we post a new user, we're going to be passing in a raw password. Okay, now we obviously don't save raw passwords into databases. So this is a great use for this hook. So I might have a password, and I say, okay, user schema.pre, before I save, take a look at this password and encrypt it, and then store it in the database. And so there are several hooks that Mongoose exposes to you. Again, it's this simple to add that functionality. It was actually really easy. You can also add custom methods. So let's say you have some operation where you're going to be doing a put operation on a user, and you're going to allow the user to update the password. You might want to have a compare password function where you can put that right on the user schema under this methods property, and the compare password function will be made available to you when you're actually working within your routes, which is what we'll see momentarily. So let's take a look. All right, so we were talking a lot about models. So here is my user model. This is my user model that we're using on this application. So here is a much larger user schema. So we're doing a UUID, a unique identifier for the user. I'm using this library called, what am I using? Node UUID to generate a unique UUID. There's different ways that you can do this as well. I just chose to do it this way because it was quick and dirty, it was easy. But Mongoose, there are plugins for Mongoose to handle this as well. But you guys, you can see that for first name and last name and email, I'm requiring them to be strings. They're required. Okay, so everything's required. And I also have this interesting validate property. So Mongoose exposes a way for you to write custom validation. So if you add this validate property, I can say validators.required string validator. And then if I just look over at my validator function, it's just a real simple value where I pass in a value, and I'm trimming it, making sure it's greater than 0, and returning. So it's actually pretty easy to validate your models. I'm also making use of the unique plugin validator right here, and so I'm making sure that my username is unique, and I'm adding that plugin. I'm also making use of the pre-save where we are passing in, we have the access to the password, and I'm using something called bcrypt to actually hash the password to make sure that it is being hashed, make sure it's being encrypted before going into the database. And we're going to see examples of all this stuff in use once we get to the routes. But I just want to show you that this stuff is pretty easy to implement. We also have a compare password where we are taking sort of the raw password, the incoming password, and we're comparing it to what's in the database and moving forward from there, and whether or not we're allowing the user to continue or not. Are there any questions about like how we're using Mongoose or what Mongoose is for as an object modeler?
Not really a question, but I would say that some of this stuff that it looks like you're doing, Mongoose does without the plugin.
And that might be true. Yeah, yeah. I mean, some of the stuff you're talking about might be terribly true, like the underscore ID property, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I did some of this stuff just to play around.
Oh, okay.
Because this is not a. I mean, this is gonna. This is a research-based app, so we can kind of like take some liberties and just play around, and this isn't done yet, right? So there are definitely some things I'm doing in here that I would like to clean up. I don't know if I'll get the time to clean up, but it was basically a learning curve, right? Where I implemented something and I was like, oh, Mongoose does that, and you know, whether or not I have time or not, maybe Mark will fix it.
Nice.
Right. Well, even the validation, the required string, I think you can do through Mongoose using their validation, but it's neither here nor there. I just wanted to.
You mean the required property?
More the validator that you're using.
Oh, you mean like, because I went and, all right, so this was more an exercise in how do I create my own custom validation.
Oh, okay.
So I was curious as to how to do it as I was digging into Mongoose, so I just wrote something simple that was like kind of harmless.
Right.
But yeah. Okay. So next, routes. Oh, and a quick note on API design. So whenever working with routes, it's very tempting to just start coding. But I would urge everyone to, where did I put it? Right here. Okay, so in doing this, I kind of created a document. This is not meant to be passed on to the client. I wasn't doing this to give them documentation on how to use the API, although you could do that. I did this for myself to think about, what do I want to return? What do I want each of the endpoints to do? And then also to run this by other people who are way smarter than I am. Like I leaned on Brad Zabo quite a bit about what a post should do versus a put. And some applications will use a post as a put. And should I do that or should I not do that? Those kind of questions. And what kind of errors should be supported? So this document really helped clarify my thought before I coded, so to speak. Does anyone else do this kind of thing? Like write that stuff out?
I test stuff.
You test stuff like that?
I have to run call, press calls and stuff. I tend to lean on stuff like
There's
some of the tools that you can
automation.
write some metacode and then it generates stuff like that.
Yeah. I just do this so, I mean, I'm a very linear thinker, and so I have to really think about what it is I'm doing. And maybe some people are better at writing metacode to generate that stuff, but for me it's just like I need a Confluence document and say, what am I actually going to code? So then when I went to code it, I was like, okay, I need to do that. And I was like, okay, I get it. So
I tend to code first, but the code should output this.
Right.
Like I think,
Yeah.
like having this documentation, I think is necessary. Like if you don't have this, then your API is not real. In my mind, like if you can't, if there's nothing to show for it, you just say, oh, I have an API someplace. There's no documentation.
yeah, and
Even if it's self-describing, RESTful, and all that fun stuff, it has to be. Like, what are all the things that you thought of? What are all the conditions for things?
Yeah.
It has to be in there.
Yeah.
I prefer it as part of the tool. I think the API should present its own documentation.
Yeah.
Just as a.
And a lot of API tools will do that.
Yeah.
I know they will. But even if there was a tool that auto-generated it, I would still sit down and do this. I mean, that's how my brain works.
Because for me, one of the things at the start of this project, because when we started it, it was myself, Bill, and then a team of unknown people from Pearson. And those people aren't here anymore, so they're really unknown. And when we showed up to the day one it was the documentation of me saying, this is what I think our API should be. And I had the documentation there. They saw it, and they were like, okay. Like it stopped any conversations about it.
Because written code wins.
Just because I had the documentation.
Right.
And so that's, it saved a whole lot of back and forth just having everything written down.
Yeah.
I know there's a couple of online tools that you can do that and actually have test data, so you can actually go hit against it and test, okay, without even writing code per se.
I'm sure there are.
If you don't have a back end or something already.
Yeah, I'm sure there are way more efficient ways to do it. What I found that this document does, though, at least if you're working on a team, another Uniconner, or maybe at a different company, if you're working on someone else's Confluence, I have found doing this before writing the code, you get agreement or you hash out issues with parties, right? So I remember, the last API that I helped write was for an application called the PPP. Which is a funny name. It makes me giggle. I remember working with Dan McCallum on it, and we went back and forth about like what a resource should return if we get like a 404, like a common issue that I think we ran into was we were going to search on something called a POP. All right, it's not important what a POP is, just a POP was a resource, right? And we're going to do a query search on it. And if it wasn't found, it was going to return a 404. And I was like, well, yeah, but that's going to throw an error in the browser, right? And then there are some people who are okay with that, and there are some people who aren't. And so, you know, some people would say, well, no, that should return an empty collection. And there are some people who would say, well, that should return a 404. What I definitely found in doing this work, this API work, just on the /users, is that there is so much ambiguity. Can't talk. Around API design, that the internet is just full of wrong answers. And even within Unicon, you know, I asked Brad Szabo, then I asked some guys that were contracting with ISOs, who are pretty senior, and even they kind of conflicted and had discussions around what should be returned when, what status codes, and it's really interesting how vague it is, right? And for someone like me who likes concreteness, I like someone to say this is the way. It hurt my head sometimes to be like, well, what do I return?
The secret, to me, the secret of API design has nothing to do with computers. Computers have this all figured out. It's the people and the conversation that's the difficult part.
Yeah. So if you get enough consensus around an API, then I think it's solid. And if you follow some pragmatic guidelines, I think you can get a solid API that will not be a pain or an irritant to other people. Right. That's my main goal: is don't be irritating to other people. Okay. Off my soapbox. All right, so what we're going to take a look at next is the user routes. And we're going to play with Postman and take a look at how these things currently operate. Right now, these are unprotected, and we're going to protect them. So how I chose to design the API routes is with the new Express4 router. If you have or have not used it, I think it's kind of neat. It's sort of its own little separate application, I guess is what I would describe it as, or its own little sandbox, where you say express.router, you define your get, your post, your put, your delete, and then you apply it back to your application with the .use method. Okay? If that makes sense. So let's take a look at these routes. Now, inside the routes, in case it's not super clear, is where we're going to use and leverage our model. Okay, so here's the user model that we're pulling in, and that user model is exactly our model that we defined with Mongoose. And so, for instance, I have protection on here. Let me turn this off. So right now, my route's unprotected. So let's take a look at this get users route. All right, so before we take a look at the code, I'm going to open up Postman. I'm going to go to my collections and go get users. All right, so here we have, I just hit send, and what do I get back? Status 200. I get results. There's my user, and total is 1. Okay, fantastic. So what is this actually doing? It's saying user model, essentially Mongo, dot find me everything, find me all my users, but don't return this stuff here. Don't return the underscore ID. Don't return the underscore V. Don't return the password. Again, I was kind of experimenting with pulling from Mongo and whatnot. And again, this is a research app, so I understand that the UUID, I mean, I could use underscore ID for that and that kind of stuff. So basically, and here's the other thing I had a question on, and I didn't always understand this, that if I get an error when talking to the database, is that a 500, right? I kind of assumed it was, but I didn't know if it was, right? So I did that anyway. In case you get 500, Mark. You're like, that false audio code and some crazy stuff.
500 is the server did something wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
400 is the client did something wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I...
What I try to do is, with stuff like that,
yeah,
figure out what the error is, and if you can't, then you last resort is a 500. But it might be that I don't know if Mongoose says this, but it might be that it's just like, hey, we can't figure out, like, we didn't find it. So
yeah, and so like the thing is, like, what I found challenging about Mongo, and I definitely be open to discussion about this if someone has found this, but I like to test everything, right? So I don't know how to test that. I don't know how to trigger that if condition to run, other than above it to type in error equals true, right? Right? Or create some or create some error object, right?
Mhm.
I don't know how to trigger it. And so I know what happens when I trigger it is it throws 500, but I don't know what the error is going to be.
What it trigger if there's no users?
See, now that's a good idea.
Yeah,
Maybe I should.
if you drop the
I
table.
mean, right there, yours.
Maybe if I drop the table, right?
Yeah.
So, but I didn't have the time to do that. So I was like, okay, that looks like a 500 to me.
Well, I think ideally you'd want to mock out the find function for that specific test to make sure it passes some error, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise you're doing
So,
integration testing.
yeah, but again, in the context of building this relatively fast,
Right.
I didn't know exactly what that was, but I read the documentation and it was an error with the database. So I'm like, okay, that's 500. This template, in case you're wondering what this is, so that's basically just a response configuration. You know, it's kind of a pattern that I saw being used, and I kind of adopted it, where I stored, you know, someone who's going to be creating a more robust API with HADOS specifications and maybe Hail or JSON LD, where you have more specific CRUD around your responses. I thought it'd be kind of cool to have a template that just kind of sits there and you take it and then you populate the template instead of writing it each time. So that gets pulled in, and then basically we update it with the 200, our users, and then we return it. Okay, so that's a pretty easy one. Let's take a look at a more complicated one where we're really using the model, and this is for post. And I want to say this again too. So I layered in some additional sort of restrictions here, and if any of you know that, oh, Mongo does that too, that would be good to know too. So let me know. So the post. So let's take a look at the post. So for the post, I've got this test user. I'm going to do test, and just change the email to test. And just so you know I'm not authenticated, let's get rid of authorization. And I'm going to post. Boom. I got a status of 201. That means obviously things were good, things were created. I can come back to RoboMongo. You can now see my object here. This is my test user. My password has been hashed. Okay, and so here's some of the restrictions that I'm going to demonstrate first, and then we'll get into the code, and you can tell me if maybe I did it wrong, or maybe Mongo will do that, or yeah, it's a pretty good way of doing it. All right, so let's say we're missing a role. Okay, let's say we're missing a property. What happens? I get a request that says, okay, let me bump that up. Close this. There you go. All right. So if I am missing a role, okay, the response is going to be 400 bad request. It tells me the fields, and the message is there are required fields are missing. Okay, that's one thing that I put in. So let's put that back in. Oh, what happened? Where'd it go? Hold on. Posts. User. If I then try to post a second time, I'm going to get a 422, which is the user has already been created. Okay, you can't post, you can't update the same user multiple times. And then if I add junk to this, junk, it's going to say bad request. Invalid fields exist within the payload request, and the fields are junk. Okay, so let's take a look at the code itself. So what I'm doing here is, here's the payload. So all that data that I was entering into the system is coming across on the payload. And I'm basically grabbing that, and I'm grabbing all the keys. And then here is also a user whitelist, right? So these are all the properties that are allowed. And in this first piece here, as well as in this area here, I am saying, do we have any rejected keys? Did anybody enter anything in here that isn't allowed? If so, return a 400 with a custom error message on it. I then move into say, okay, well, all the fields are great, fantastic. Are there any keys missing? And I do that through this loop here, and I do a conditional here where I basically say if any keys are missing, throw a 400 because a 400 is bad content, and then the user with a custom message says user missing field name. Lastly, all the fields are present, and here's our user model finally, where I'm going to query the database. I'm going to say for the username that's unique, look up that user. If the user exists already, throw a 422, okay? Because we don't want to post. We're not treating the post as a put. And lastly, here's where our Mongoose implementation really comes into play, where if everything goes as planned, no one's trying to post multiple times, people have entered everything correctly, we create a new user model. Here are all the properties. And then this user save function maps directly to our user model right here, this save. This will get called during the put right here. So user save, the pre-save function will get called, our password will get hashed if everything goes correctly. And then it winds up in our database right here. Any questions or comments about that?
I have a quick question on the whitelisting of fields.
Yeah.
Is there a specific reason that you did that? My thoughts are that a consumer of this may be using a front-end framework like Angular or whatever that'll tack on its own properties to objects that are bound. Like Angular has the hash key, the $$ hash key property and stuff. So you're already translating the payload into a user and you're mapping the fields to actually go. Mm-hmm. So in that case, extra fields shouldn't hurt anything. So I'm curious the reasoning there.
Okay, so the reasoning is that I'm new to back-end work, and I didn't consider that.
Oh, gotcha.
So I mean, one of the things in taking on this project that I'm doing, one of my weak areas is back-end development. And one of my personal goals is on any project I'm on to take some ownership of something that's back end. And so on this project, it's a research project, right? So I took ownership of all of it. And some things are going to be bad, and some things are going to be okay, and then some things I'll do pretty well, right? And then I generally use things like this, the forum, to say, hey guys, what did I screw up? Or I'll ask, I'll do like little sessions with Brad Szabo and say, tell me what I did completely wrong here. Maybe here's the whole reason, Bradley, is that I was like, my thought behind that was only these properties should be updated. For some reason I thought restricting it would be a good idea, and I thought, okay, I get it. Like, I'm not going to let them. I'm going to protect them from themselves, so to speak. And only allow them to update certain things. I actually don't know if that's a common practice with back-end developers if they do that. And so that's like an area where I would reach out to a back-end dev and ask them, is this something you guys do, or am I just being overly cautious? Am I being overly protective with this route logic? The cool thing about Node is you can take things out pretty quickly.
There could be use cases for it.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you have one, but like in this, but there's, the fact that it's actually better to be more paranoid than less paranoid.
Well, and so I guess
adding stuff to the database.
So I guess the use case for this, I actually forgot about this. I do actually have one use case, and that use case, is essentially the user or the client requested that we be able to take a CSV file of users, and that we could consume it, and that we could build up a database of users for them, right? Okay, that's great. I would have loved to have done that instead, but we never got the CSV file, and it was quite a challenge extracting that information. And so to satisfy the contract, I created an API that someone could, using curl or something, dynamically create a user, and if needed, we could easily create a batch function to do a whole bunch of them, right? And so I was thinking, I want to protect the client from themselves. and restrict anything that they can enter into this thing.
So
I totally forgot. That's why I did it. That's why I did it.
So about Mongoose, because you defined a schema, it should not save anything to the DB that's not included in that schema.
I figured that as much, but it's still kind of paranoid programming, right?
And the reverse is true as well, so that if you validate and something's missing, it should tell you, as long as you set required on those fields. That's the whole reason for putting required on those fields.
So I noticed that, and it did work, Ryan. And what I didn't like was the response object. So I'll give you an example. So I did that, and it wasn't as formatted as I wanted it to, and I didn't know if I could tell Mongoose to return me what I wanted. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. So
the reason why I was overly protective on that, I want to be able to send back custom error messages, and Mongoose just was it sent back the correct stuff, but it was just a string. And I'm like, well, I want more than that.
We could still respond differently in the API.
I was having issues.
Okay.
Maybe I can share that with you later, because I did see that Mongoose was catching this stuff, but the response objects weren't coming back the way I wanted them. But anyway, we can get into that. So that's kind of a nuance of Mongoose, but okay, back on track. Finally, authenticating and creating a token. Again, we're going to create an authentication route. Now, for authentication, I actually like to route this under a, typically you'll see /API. I've been separating mine out. I kind of like a /auth, because API authentication, to me, feels like more functional programming. It's not really resource-based to a degree.
RPC.
What's that? Yeah.
Procedure call.
Yeah. And so I just kind of sectioned it off. Same process here. We're going to define auth API route depending based upon the express router. We're going to define the post operation itself with /login, and we are going to then apply it to our application under the /auth route. And then at a very, very high level, we are going to use the JSON web token to require that library, and we're going to then say token equal to, we're going to assign our token. I can't even talk right now. We are going to take the user object, create a token, and sign it with that library and our secret. If you remember in the beginning of the talk, there was a database configuration secret. That's the secret that is right here, and that's the config that we are using to get that information. And we're saying it expires in 60 minutes. And then returning a 200 with the token.
That was my question.
What?
60 milliseconds?
No, 60 minutes. So this library actually, it used to have, the expires is in seconds, is in minutes, but it translates it down to seconds, right? So I guess it's just easier for humans to say minutes, right? So let's take a closer look. Okay, so here I have an authentication route. Here is my JWT, and for anyone who's not, JWT stands for JSON Web Token. Here is my user model again. I am pulling in or creating a new router instance. Here is my login, /login, and what I'm doing is I'm saying for my user model, using Mongoose to say find one username. If the resource isn't found, return a 404 with a custom failure message. If the resource is found, now this is where I use that custom Mongoose compare password. The password that the user passed in on the request body gets pulled in and compared with what's in my database. If everything works great, here we have the token where we sign. We create the token, we sign the token with the secret, and we specify what the expires in property. Now, before I do this, let me just say that I am dumping way too much stuff into my JWT. My token is way too big, I have to slim it down, but it's one of those improvements, again, a research app. So let me just show you how this works. I've got a very, you'll see, don't laugh. All right, there's my token. I got to cut it down. I'm passing in way too much information here.
It actually looks pretty normal to me.
You think they're that big?
Yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
But you should strip out like password and
Yeah.
right. So all that stuff. So I don't know if I don't think I had the password in on this one, but
Probably if you go to JSON, is it jwt.io?
yeah.
You can see what the claims are in there. You just paste that in.
So this is the size of my token, and obviously it's been generated. Okay, so we'll be using that, and that will work for the next 30 minutes is what I have the app set for. Okay, so how do we now lock it down? So route middleware to protect routes. I really like this. It's pretty nifty. And if you're not familiar with Node or the term middleware, really what are we doing? The request is coming in. We're going to create a route middleware function that is going to essentially intercept that request and either bounce it back or it's going to pass it along. And that's pretty much it. That's all it does. This is the general syntax of that middleware function where you basically say users API routes. That's the variable that has the router instance cached. We're going to say use this function with the request, the response, and next. In case you don't know what next is basically this is basically a control flow function, and next is the next function to run. Okay, so that's why you call next when you're done. And what we're gonna, I've got dots in here and above and below it because there's work that has to happen. But in general, what this token or what this method is going to do is going to say, I see that you passed me a token. I'm going to decode that token, and if it's decoded successfully, we're going to pass it along to the route. Let's take a closer look. All right. So in my user's routes, this is my user's route. I have already defined middleware to verify the token. Here is my actual function. This is the user's API routes.use, and it's pointing to, or it's basically passing, it's saying, it's passing along responsibility to the JWT strategy function. And that was pulled in here at the very top. I just separated it out because it was just a little bit of logic that I just felt like belonged by itself. Here is the strategy itself. Here's the request object, the response, and the next. And so here's what we're doing. I'm being a little generous here, and I don't know if this is a good or bad thing, but I'm basically saying, look, I'd love it if you sent me the token in the header, because that's where it's supposed to be. But if you happen to send it on the body, I'll accept it. Or if you're sending it via the query parameter, I'll take that as well. And this is a very simple if statement. If the token is there, we move through our verification process. If it's not, we return with a token missing error. I will say here, if this function throws an error, it means the token is expired. So let's go demonstrate this working since I turned it on. All right, so let me just grab this guy and keep this in my... let's go get users now. And right now I have an old token in my header. Hit send. It's going to say 401 not authorized, token has expired. If I remove the token and hit send, it's going to say missing authentication token. If I add the correct token, it's going to give me what I want. And so that has been applied to every single route under the user route, for all user routes. Okay, so now if I wanted to lock down other routes, okay, so our application actually does have other routes that are not locked down at this current stage because more API work has to deal with them. And the way that we would simply do that and lock those down is we would just replicate this pattern. across all of any APIs that we have. Okay, so if you look at our actual code, we've got a groups API and a students API, and we would simply replicate this approach to lock down those routes. And the routes that we have open, like the authentication routes, they don't have any of that because these need to stay public and open.
You can also, one thing that may save you some time there and some replication, I believe you can, at your top level, you can just create a router and then use a sub-router.
Yeah.
But before you use sub-routers, you can insert your middleware.
Yeah.
So then globally, I mean, you may want to be more granular than that.
There's definitely tons of ways of doing this stuff, right? So one thing about Express is it's pretty flexible, right? I actually like the idea of, I know it's a little bit of repetition, but I like the pattern of, this is my route, and I want to protect everything inside of here, right? And then I can create, and then so if I need to create a different type of route, I can, and maybe pieces of it don't need to be, you know, and so I kind of like that, right? I like the granularity.
Yeah.
But I mean, you could also see on like the application that I'm working on right now, there's over a dozen routes, and there's multiple apps, so it's spread across. So there's probably like 36, 40 instances of routes.
Okay, so I guess it depends on the application, right? So this is small.
Yeah,
right.
But I mean, it is, like you said, flexible in that.
You can change that.
Yeah, you can do, well, I want to do a public route and then do the sub-router.
Yeah.
Or you want to be specific and hit each one. But it's not like it's a lot of code, so it's easy to move around.
So let's take a look. Now this is in development, so if it breaks, I thought I got all the bugs out, but this is the implementation I had to work on. I had to put an application behind sort of lock and key, and sort of we're in the process of doing that, and then I'm going to hand this off to Mark and Philip, and they're going to finish it. But here's our login, and if I try to go to the dashboard, it's going to say no. If I type in foo bar, it's going to be like, what's your problem? You don't know what you're doing, add your real stuff in. All right, so there's a real guy in here named admin. Sign in. Whoops, is that not working? Admin? I thought I had a user in there called admin. Yeah, okay, typed it wrong. So if I'm an admin, I get logged in now, and so if I go back to login, once I've authenticated, it's going to bounce me back to dashboard. Now, some people may like that, some people may not like that, but that's sort of the protection that we're putting in place. And what we're saying is, if I hit the login route, just check, am I already authenticated? If I'm already authenticated, bounce me over to the dashboard, which is really where I want to go. There's no really reason to hang out at the login. And how we're doing that is I created a special route for that under the authentication called status. And again, this is not the best implementation. Okay, I'm hitting the status route a lot. Again, this is a quick and dirty way of doing it. But every single time I hit a route that I want to protect, I am saying /status. What is my status? Okay, pass in the token. Is my token expired or not? If it's expired, send an error, and the UI will bounce me to the login screen. A better approach to this would be to not hit the URL each time, but a better approach would be have some sort of base64 decoder on the client to decode the expiration, and to say, okay, let me just have a general function that says, I got the token, decode it, what's the expiration date? Oh, you still got time. You're authenticated. You can stay in the app. Okay, that's a much easier approach, but this was quick and dirty, and it's a research app. So
you still have to authenticate it on the server because the client's a liar.
Yeah, I thought.
No.
I thought the whole point.
For each of your endpoints, yeah, which I think you're already doing.
Yeah, for each of the endpoints I'm doing.
Protected endpoint.
You mean just for the log?
But then to avoid making a request when the client already knows, if it's a well-behaved client, if it already knows that it's got an expired token, it can just do a refresh or something.
Yeah.
Or go back to the login without a round trip.
Yeah, that's one of the really nice things about JWT specifically, being able to pass that kind of stuff.
What I'm suggesting is this, is like, so what I'm doing here is very chatty, okay? Every time that our app let's just take it from the beginning. I go to the site. I go to log in. I get a token.
Making the request status.
I get a
Oh, okay.
I get a token, right? And I store that token in local storage on the client, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now every single time I now hit a different route, okay? I'm going to look at that local storage token and say, and use this endpoint and say, am I still authenticated? Is my token still valid? If it says yes, you're free to continue as you are. If it says no, it bounces you to the login screen. And what I'm saying is a better approach than using an endpoint is to have a decoder that can extract the expiration date on the client so that the client will say, I got this token from the server, I got it an hour ago, it's way past expiration, go to the login screen. Delete the token from my client and go to the login screen instead.
Now, isn't that the whole purpose of the token is so they can't really decrypt it?
You can, well, they can't decrypt all of it.
To some extent, I mean.
The JSON web token is usually not
But if you don't
encrypted,
know
it's
that-
just signed.
But you don't know that's
Sorry, I'm using the wrong
token.
term. Yeah, it's just signed.
If you so that's fine if you know where the token came from. But if you don't know where the token came from, I would think that'd be a security issue.
Well, that's what the signature is to validate where it came from.
So when you
It's cryptographically
Versus,
signed.
I mean, what
So
you're saying.
so the way the token becomes fully decrypted or decoded is with the secret. The client won't have the secret. What the client can do is decode a portion of the token, which is the expiration. That's what I'm saying.
I just wonder why couldn't you store when you get the token, store another field, another storage that says it expires on this, and you just check to see.
I have. No, I have done that, right? I have done that. It's in local storage.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to expire 1 minute after it expires on the server, right? So.
I mean, when you log in, you get your token.
Yeah.
When you go to a page, it's going to make an API call.
Yes.
If the token's expired, the API will fail.
It's going to fail anyway.
We're going to go back to.
Yeah.
So if the API doesn't fail, the status is.
So the reason, okay, so you might say, well, the status isn't really needed, and maybe it's not, but it's possible to have a route where you have all static content, you still want to keep protected. And so nothing on that route is going to actually make a request out to get data, but you still want to protect it. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
But it's not going to be protected
Yeah, it's on
at that point because you
protecting
can't
on
force
the client.
some dude with curl to hit
Well,
status
okay.
endpoints.
Yeah, I guess this was just a quick way. Maybe I'm not articulating this part correctly, but this was just a quick way to say, is my token valid, and whether or not my route, just my UI route is authenticated or not.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's just a really quick, dirty, chatty way of doing it that I wouldn't do it if this wasn't a research app.
Okay.
I would find a better solution, but this does work.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's basically a who. I mean, have you guys ever coded a who am I, like a me endpoint, like get authentication
Yeah.
me. It's the same thing. It's like that's what this is.
Okay.
Have you ever? I don't know, you never heard of that?
Yeah, and you can store it inside the actual token, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's better implementations, but basically that's how the login is working, right? So like if I were to then come in here, I mean, I can hit refresh, and it's not going to bounce me anywhere. My token's still valid, right? It's bouncing me to the dashboard. But if I came in and I said resources, local session, delete, 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 where's my keys? Keys. I delete all that, and I hit refresh, it's going to bounce me back to the login because I don't have a token anymore, right? So that's all we're doing. Okay. Okay, and we're done. Questions? No? Great.
Made it into the last slide.
So I'll open it up. I guess before I open it up, I'll just say this talk assumed, obviously, knowledge of Node. It assumed knowledge of back-end systems. I am definitely not an expert. I took this stuff on as a learning project because it was a great scope for that. So I personally like talks that are more advanced and less about startup, like, you know, less about getting started. So I just assumed a whole bunch of stuff. So that was by design. If anyone's feedback is that I just jumped in and didn't explain a whole bunch of stuff.
Well, I was late, so did you go over like what JWT is and like JWT versus
Yes, I did.
other stuff in the beginning?
So what I did as a quick, go back to the beginning. Probably could have done that better. So for John and Gary and Mark, I'll do the extra fast one. None shall pass. This is what I imagine authentication to be. Little Gandalf in my code. Who's using it? It's used everywhere. It's used for all major APIs. Why do we use tokens? We use them because the old way of doing it really doesn't work anymore. It's not scalable. And the old way of doing it, it's a problem with sessions is that servers have no memory. The way that they remember stuff, typically didn't.
Okay.
So the user would go to the site.
I can hear the people talking. Practice, software practice.
Software practice at 7.
You guys mute? The user would log in. The server would save the session. The server would save the user in session, and then the server would check the session on every single request, right? So the problem with that is overhead. Okay, with all the devices that we have on the planet today, all hitting a single API, it's hard to maintain all the server overhead and the application load. So tokens to the rescue. And the reason why tokens work is because it's stateless. We don't have to worry about sessions at all. And so you're free to scale. And the description of how it works is the same thing. The person goes to a website, server delivers the website, user tries to log in, the server says, I understand who you are, sends a token back, a signed token, and now on every single request, the client is going to send a token, and the database or the server is going to say, I know who you are, and I'll send you back your data. And then that's when Don Draper yelled at me to show something real. And then that's what we got into the app.
Okay.
All right, so that was like the 30-second spiel. Does anyone want to, I don't know, I'll open it up. Any comments, questions about
I'll start, since I was...
Yeah, what's up, John? Johnny come lately?
I really like the visuals.
Oh, we're doing feedback? Oh, okay. I was asking.
I was trying to claim that first spot.
No, he was looking for questions.
I was looking for questions.
Okay, we'll wait, but then we'll go back.
Yeah.
All I did, right?
John wants to go first.
Just like shotgun.
I'll ask you all my questions in the car.
On the car ride home? Yeah. Are there any questions?
Did you look at anything like OpenID Connect, since you're actually not super far from there?
I did not. So I actually had a very quick turnaround for this, right? So we're talking 140 hours total, and I kind of had to get this done in a week, 8 days or 5 days. So I immediately went to Pluralsight. I mean, again, I know what these things are, but I had to go beef up on them, right?
Yeah.
So I spent like a day doing Mongoose training, Mongo training on Pluralsight. I then read a bunch of articles. I then talked to some backend devs about API design outside of what I would normally do. Like, you know, I'm the guy in charge of this. Like, how would you do it?
Mm-hmm.
And then out of that came a whole bunch of other things I need to go learn, like JSON LD as a potential. You know, and I'm sure there's a tons of tools that I'm not aware of, and I probably misused Mongoose a few times, but it's you know, not that bad, right? So again, the goal is my goal is I want to get better at the back end. I just want to attack the back end because I feel like it's a weakness of mine, and I want to eventually dominate in it. Be like, I am as awesome at the back end as I am with pictures of Leonardo DiCaprio. And I even want to move into the Java area. I want to understand Spring Boot. And how do I do the same thing using Spring configuration? Because on a project, it can really help if I just want to own the REST part. I want to go in and write that piece. I'm already comfortable with Java, but like I'm not comfortable with Spring. How do I do that, right?
So I can get you halfway there by messing with your node mod to just insert like a 20-minute delay before it reloads your scripts.
Wow.
Goes over well with the software development.
Spit out a random
I will say that
text for like 20 minutes.
doing it in Node is wicked fast, and you can.
So I guess that brings up a question. Why on earth would you ever consider going Java and Spring Boot?
Well, part of it is exposure to things that I just don't know about, right? So like, I think there's a lot of value in just learning things that I'm just not exposed to every day. I'll give you an example. I took a course on, it's going to be a snooze fest, but I took a course on data algorithms and structures, right? And I am not an algorithmic type of thinker, right? It hurts my head. But I understand now how merge sort works, quick sort works. I understand what someone says when they say linked list, what that actually is under the hood, what's going on, why is it better or worse than an array list, right? Like I understand all that stuff now because I exposed myself to it.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to expose myself to some of the Java stuff so that I just get a greater understanding. Because one day I think technology is technology. It's all kind of cool.
Yeah.
But
I see. I mean, I agree that exposure to new ideas and all that other good stuff, but I see Java as. I mean, I look at things going forward, and I'm looking to stay away from Java. If it says Java, it's away from anything I do, and just hitching my wagon entirely to AWS and cloud.
I'm assuming you're okay with JavaScript.
JavaScript. It doesn't have the script, but I mean,
Yeah.
with everything that I've been seeing, like between Amazon.
Well, I'm not saying I'm trying to become a Java developer. I'm saying that that I want exposure to the Spring framework, and that if I'm on a project, because we're still very much heavy in Java, I like full ownership of a project. I mean,
Absolutely.
It's just my general nature. I like my hands in all of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I can educate myself in terms of a framework to use in the back end, if we have to use Java, or name your framework, I still would like to work in it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say too, the overwhelming mass of server software is still written in Java, and my general philosophy is if you want to move something, you got to get close to it. So can't push things from far away. So the better I can communicate with Java developers and say, hey, if you check out Express.
Compare them intelligibly to say you do it the same thing.
The other cool thing is there's a lot of Java frameworks have done this already. They're mature. And maybe there are things in there that are difficult in Node. I mean, I don't know. I can't compare them yet. But
my experience with Java Spring Boot, and it's just, if given the choice.
Of course, given the choice, I'd rather write JavaScript.
Well, no, I mean, if given the choice, I would move entirely towards the cloud. And even as far, it would depend on what if I.
But you can still write Java in the cloud.
Yeah.
I
would.
I'm not saying.
why? And that's what I'm getting at is.
Mark, why would you? Okay, I'll give you an example.
Why
Why would you? Some clients are afraid of the drastic change that Node and developing in the cloud brings, right? And so, like, one of the clients we're starting a project with now, the application, we have the ability to recommend Node and a NoSQL database if it makes sense for the project. But they're an entirely Java shop operation, and it scares them to death doing that. It does. They're willing to do it, but they're terrified, right?
And there's also the question of budget. I mean, it would cost a fortune for some companies to completely redo their infrastructure or retrain employees to use JavaScript, anything like that.
I mean, there's still some use cases that are better Java if you're doing computational heavy.
Yeah, I mean, it is, it just, I mean, when I see when I take a look at where things are moving, to me,
they're moving towards JavaScript. Yeah,
it's all moving towards AWS.
Yeah.
Yes, you can do Java in the cloud, you can spit, but I think for a lot of like that entire app,
yeah,
if we're looking at something like a web app type of setup, that there is no, the architecture just doesn't have it. It's serverless.
Yeah, it's all in AWS,
which is a lot more like what you just showed using Express.
Yeah,
it's just running, on the.
And I'm sure more modern, lean projects are all going to go towards AWS, and they're all going to. I mean, and it's going to be on demand, right? So I totally agree with that. But we're a consulting firm, and it's still legacy. There's still a lot of legacy out there. Mm-hmm. And so while I may not be the guy who wants to code in something older, I like new stuff. I think a lot of developers do. I like exposure to it, and knowing something other than what you know only makes you a better programmer. It's just my opinion. But
so, what was OpenID Connect? How does that fit into what Matt presented?
OpenID Connect is basically kind of picks up where OAuth 2 leaves off. Because if you read the OAuth 2 spec, there's a lot of like how does the flow work, but then like how do you the actual implementation of how do you communicate user information is totally up in the air. So OpenID Connect is basically OAuth 2 plus JSON Web Token, and then a couple like defining a well-known endpoint for discovery, kind of stuff like that. But
so it's kind of a layer on top of what Matt. Like
yeah.
More specification.
Yeah, essentially, and then it gives you kind of a framework for dealing with other people's information. Like how do I trust Google as a provider? Like, how do I verify that this token came from Google, kind of thing. So if you want to let people give a little login with Google button, and they don't have to create their own, they don't have to store a password on your site. They can just remember their Google password. You can do stuff like that.
Some of the articles I read mentioned, they call it permission-based tokens, or where you basically say this is from this provider. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's what the signature is for. It's like, well, you can generate a JSON structure and then put it in base64, but to generate the signature, you need the secret key.
Yeah.
And all your consumers, like your app that trusts Google, can have Google's certificate, which is their public key. Mm-hmm. And then you can do some math, which that little library takes care of for you and says, yep, this came from Google, or this list of people we trust.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool.
And then, so then you can trust that the information contained in that token is valid, and like it is user andrewstewart@gmail.com, that kind of stuff. Cool. Whatever's in the token.
Any other questions or comments?
You were worried about your status messages. They were pretty robust compared to some of the testing I've done. Generic like 200s or 500s and stuff.
Cool. So the comment, I'm not sure everyone on the phone heard that. Doug mentioned that the status messages were more robust in the research app than you've seen on some apps.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I read, if you're not familiar with Apogee, am I saying them right? Apogee? They are like an API think tank, implementers, consultants. They're like, they preach pragmatic REST. And I just have a bunch of documentation from them, and I've read a bunch of stuff from them, and they talked about like what's a good error syntax to use, right? And I kind of followed them where they basically said, do the status code, do the message that comes from the status code, send those together, and then have a developer message which is verbose and says what's wrong and how to fix it. I just kind of say what's wrong because it's a research app, but if I was really doing it, I would have.
But it's pretty good.
But then it also said like things like, if you're going to have missing fields or you're going to have something like that, list the fields and then say, fields are missing or something like that, right? So yeah. But again, working with JSON and JavaScript, it was pretty wicked easy to put that together.
But that does bring up the point of everything comes back 400 error or everything comes back 500 error with no message. You're trying to decipher
What do you mean everything does?
My favorite. So it's an error, but you return it 200.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I don't. I return.
Yeah, no, not on yours.
Some
You're working with some other API.
Yeah.
What you send, everything comes back 200.
And
When I
it's
designed
funny,
it,
so like,
when I designed
different
it, I
REST
tried
calls will
to,
give you different responses too.
I tried to say, like, I tried to really think about this is a resource. If this resource isn't found, it's a 404. If I'm trying to access it and you're supposed to be authenticated, it's a 401. And I tried to really think about what my status code should be. And there were some weird places with the API where I went back and forth with Brad about, like, well, the internet says you're wrong, Brad. And Brad was like, well, they're wrong.
Well, it's like your question of if you're going to do a get on an endpoint for a resource, and you're just going to say get me all the users.
Yeah.
If there's no users in that,
You return a collection.
you return an empty collection.
Yeah, because it's a collection.
It's not an error.
Right.
It's just saying here's all of the users.
Yes.
Which are zero. If you try to get user ID 1234 and 1234 doesn't exist,
And that's an actual resource.
then it's actually not found.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of but that's part of the communication.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard. API design is not easy, and I will definitely say any estimate, at least, if you have to design like 3 or 4 endpoints, with all the verbs, I would be like at least 3 to 4 days of thinking about it before you build it. I mean, if you really want to do a good job, right? Of what is this thing going to do and what is it going to return and that kind of stuff. It's hard. It's good mental exercise, though. Any other questions?
I'll also point out too, I think it's RFC 70. You can end a lot of arguments by going to the good book, which is RFC 7231. Has very detailed descriptions on all the header fields, all the error codes, and when you're allowed to, or what it means when I get back at 302, or when I get back at 403.
I was curious what the 422 was.
The 422 was
it
was entity couldn't be
Unprocessable.
unprocessable. So
it's a web data extension.
Yeah.
So
That's what I was wondering. So the web data support,
most clients wouldn't understand it, but
yeah.
At this point, you can do whatever the heck you feel like.
Yes, you can, and some people do.
Very important 418. I'm a teapot.
Which one's 418?
It's actually real.
I'm a teapot.
It was in a spec, but it was part of a April Fool's joke.
Twitter's is what.
So the other thing they said to do is send start with code number 800 or 600 or pick one that's not a real HTTP status code, and send that along with a link for more information with say your domain /800 or whatever it is, and that would give a very detailed description of the issue. I think Angular does that to some degree when you get errors.
Oh, they're little.
Yeah.
Wrapper function.
But that's really robust error handling. I didn't have time for that.
I think a lot of that just comes down, there's the basics,
Yeah.
and then it's the maturity of the application.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, to do all that stuff well, you need to iterate over it.
It takes a lot of time.
It takes a lot of time. But, when you're only building 3 endpoints, right, for a simple app, you can kind of explore those ideas a little bit, which is why this was fun to do. It was a time crunch to get it done. Any other questions?
Yeah, Matt, where does the token get stored? On the server.
On the server, it
doesn't.
It doesn't. It's stateless. So that you bring up a good point, Chris. So, log out, right? So log out. You notice? I don't know if you noticed. I didn't have a log out function, and so there are different ways of handling log out. And again, if other people know different, correct me if I'm wrong. But some people say I'm not going to have a log out on a log out route. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my sessions or my expiration timestamps short, 30 minutes and under, right? And what's supposed to happen is the client, when they're done, or you click the log out button, you can provide one to the client, or you close the app or whatever, okay, that the client deletes or throws away the token when you're done with it. And you keep the sessions short, so that way, even if I try to access the app with a token, 30 minutes is a small window, right? Now, some people say that they don't like that, and so what some people do is they will have a logout function that takes the token, and they'll take it and they'll store it in the database with like a flag that says I've been used or not, right? Like used, true or false type of thing. And so then you'll add an extra layer to each of your route middleware, essentially to say, you know, hey, give me the token. Let me look you up in the database. Have you been used or not? And if you have been used, then I gotta tell you can't access the data. You have to re-authenticate. All right, but you know, I had this argument. I didn't actually have this argument. I had a discussion with Brad about that, and I said, well, that seems like you're managing state, which kind of goes against the whole token idea, right? And overhead. And you know, he kind of confirmed that some people will do that as sort of extra layer of security or make themselves feel more secure. But that's not really the approach. The approach is short, very short token durations. And then what you would do is, let's say your token duration was really short, like 20 minutes, right? You would have new refresh token idea, right, where you would open up a session, kind of like a session timeout box, right, where you say you're about to be logged out, right, and you can renew your token, if that makes sense.
You don't even need to show it to the user. It could just be done in the back.
Right.
Yeah. Just saying, like, you can do it like that, or you know, however you want.
That's how I've done it in the past.
Effectively generate a new token on the server on every request if you really felt.
Yeah.
If you wanted to.
There'd probably be a little bit prohibitive computationally because of the signing.
Exceptionally.
It's a lot of math.
Yeah, that would be exceptionally overkill, but you know, that's technically possible.
But there's strategies for refreshing the token, and basically the idea is just keep it short, and it helps with security because the token is going to be throwaway. Any other questions? All right, John.